Thanks, John. John Williams has joined the choir for these Monteverdi Vespers, and I discovered that he was an absolute mine of information about Monteverdi. So I thought I'd come and talk to you today. And really, I just wondered actually if you'd like to sort of talk about your relationship with the Monteverdi Vespers, because it goes back
Sure,
quite a long way, doesn't it?
it does. And it goes back to when I was a student studying music at York University in the late 1970s. So I should explain that I went to university, I think in 1976, and I went to do English and related literature. And after a year, because I was doing so much practical music, they sort of said to me in the music department, why don't you come and do a degree in music instead? So I changed subject. Uh, Sorry, this is a bit autobiographical, but it is relevant. I'll come to that in a moment. And the way that the music course was structured meant you did a series of projects over the 3 years that you were there. One of them had to be a practical project, which the whole music department participated in. And there was one of those per year, but you had to submit one of them as part of your course. And you had to do what they called a solo project, which was essentially a portfolio of work that you generated the title of yourself. And you submitted that work as part of your degree. The reason why I'm stretching this so far back is because in my first year as a music student, my second year at the university, but first year as a music student, the practical project that we did in the autumn was a performance of Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, which was composed in 1607 and was arguably the first opera. Well, it's actually the first opera that's widely performed today. There were other works by other composers that predated it slightly that could be described as the first opera. But the point that I'm getting to here is that Orfeo, was a major work by Monteverdi. And then 2 years later, another major work by Monteverdi, the Vespers of 1610, was going to be performed in the York Festival in 1980. And one of the lecturers who was going to be conducting it said to me, have you considered your solo project? Because I'd like you to do the performing edition of the Monteverdi Vespers for your solo project. And I did.
Performing edition. Tell us a bit more what that means.
It means, well, it's a loaded question in a way because virtually everybody who sets out to perform the Monteverdi Vespers has to produce a kind of performing edition of sorts because it's decisions have to be made. It's not like a modern score where the composer, has made all the decisions about what instruments are going to be playing and when they play and how they're going to be played. A lot of that is missing from the original publication of 1610. And in fact, the original publication, there isn't a score at all. It's a collection of part books. So the cantus part would all be in one book, the bassus part in another, and the nearest to a score is the continuo part, the bassus continuo part. It's a kind of short score, if you like. Um, so, in a way, modern performers have to go through a similar process to what they had to go through in the 17th century, which is to kind of compile uh, a version from those part books um, and uh, and make decisions on who's going to play and who and when. Some of that has already been made by Monteverdi in some parts, but clearly there are movements like Dixit Dominus, for example, the first psalm in the Vespers. There are choral parts all laid out. We know which sort of part is which. But at the end of each section in Dixit Dominus, there's an instrumental ritornello, a little refrain played by instruments. But Monteverdi doesn't specify what instrument should play it. So it's up to the modern performer to make that decision. I mean, there is an instrumentation laid out in the publication, So we'll be experiencing that when we perform it in Wells Cathedral. There's the cornets and sackbuts, the violins, and cellos, and so on, and continuo instruments. But who plays those ritornelli? You have to make that decision.
And do you think Monteverdi deliberately did that?
Yeah,
Didn't specify then?
yeah, it was. I mean, the evidence in there suggests that Monteverdi realized that there would be different circumstances in which the music would be performed. And in fact, in that very piece, Dixit Dominus, he writes a little Latin rubric which more or less says, if you haven't got the instruments, don't do the ritornelli. Just leave them out. And you can apply that to some of the other movements in the piece that have ritornelli, like the hymn Ave Maristella, for example, that you could do it without any of the instrumental ritornelli or interludes in it. And there, the publication is such that it does leave provision for flexible ways in which to perform all of this stuff. There are two settings of the Magnificat in the publication. There's the 7-part Magnificat, which we'll be performing. There's a 6-part Magnificat with just continuo. So if you haven't got all those obligato instruments, you haven't got all the toys from the cupboard, you can still perform the Vespers. And in fact, I have performed it in the past without all of the instruments and stuff, with just organ. But yeah, that's. There's also other aspects to producing a performing edition. I mean, I've got my performing edition than I did here. This is it. Just got pencil markings in as to what instruments are playing, and this is based on an edition which is no longer published by Gottfried Wolters, which is the nearest at the time when I worked on it. Was an urtext or clean text. But the other big question, there are two other big questions really. One is, what movements do you actually play or sing? Because the 1610 publication, features a whole load of music. It features a mass setting in Illo Tempore, as I say, 2 settings of the Magnificat, as well as the Vespers Psalms and these so-called sacred concertos, these motets to be sung by soloists in various combinations. And then this tour de force of virtuosic instrumental writing, the Sonata Sopra Sancta Maria, with this incredible kind of mantra-like litany sung by the sopranos. How does all this tie together? It doesn't make much sense from a liturgical point of view. There are things missing from the publication that make it liturgical. And that's chiefly Gregorian or plain song antiphons that in a liturgical performance, of a liturgical rendition of the Vespers, you'd be expected to perform an antiphon before and after each psalm, the same antiphon. In later years, it was allowed that for the antiphon just to be performed after the psalm, but they're missing.
I feel a bit ignorant, John. I don't know what an antiphon is.
Oh, good question. Of course, Vespers, of course, is one of the canonical hours or divine hours, part of the divine office of the Catholic Church. The main part of worship in the Catholic Church is the celebration of the Mass. But then the canonical hours or divine office are those services that break up the day, like matins and in the morning, vespers in the evening, compline at night, and there are others too. And they're all characterized by opening versical responses, a set of psalms, and a canticle. So in the case of Vespers, that's the Magnificat. In the case of Compline, it would be the Nunc Dimittis. But all throughout, all of this, normally this would all be chanted to Gregorian chant. But psalms, before each psalm, there would be a short piece of plain song, so-called antiphon, and then the psalm would be chanted, and then the same short piece of chant, antiphon, would be performed at the end of the psalm. So the psalm was kind of bookended, if you like, between these two little antiphons. They're missing from the 1610 publication, and some editors have inserted them in their editions. And then the presence of the sacred concertos, these texts from, some of them are from the Song of Songs, like Nigra sum and pulchra es, duo seraphim. These are all non-liturgical texts. And so what was their purpose? Why, what are they doing there? They're not contributing to a celebration of the Vespers as part of a liturgical service. So scholars think that they're actually antiphon substitutes. So they've uncovered evidence to suggest that even instrumental canzonas or organ canzonas were used as substitutes for the Gregorian antiphons. And these, and part of the argument is the position of the pieces within the publication, because they're not kind of lumped together and separated off. They're interspersed between the psalms in the part books. So it kind of suggests that they're there to act as antiphon substitutes. And that's why, they've become part of the Vespers of 1610 that we all know and love today and perform. But earlier editions of the Vespers, particularly before the kind of era of historical performance, recreation, if you like, that brought back some of the instruments of the Vespers. Early editions like this one by Dennis Stevens, published by Novello, it left those out completely. So you only got the Psalms and the Magnificat, left out those solos and duos and trios that are more often performed today.
It's really interesting how, because a lot of the perception is, I think I spoke to Chris yesterday, one of the reactions from one of his choirs was, oh, it's too expensive to put on. But that's making an assumption that you need all of the extra bits, whereas you say actually you could do it in quite a simple way.
Now, whether it would be a kind of crowd pleaser as a concert piece, I don't know. But there are some other interesting aspects about the Vespers as well from a historical point of view. I don't think there's any historical record to suggest that there was a performance. I mean, we know that l'Orfeo is performed at the ducal palace in Mantua. There's even possibility of tying it down to a single room in the palace. And we know who performed it. Performers are named. There are tantalizing parallels between l'Orfeo and the Vespers. The instrumentation specified is very, very similar, and some of the compositional devices are shared in between the two works. And some people surmise that possibly the same singers and instrumentalists performed it, because 1610, it's only 3 years after the composition of Orfeo, and although the Vespers was published in Venice, it's more likely to have been composed while he was working at Mantua. And, it could be exactly the same performers.
What was his role working in Mantua?
He was working for the Duke as the kind of court composer. And it leads to questions as to what was the purpose of the 1610 publication. And again, a number of theories have emerged. One is, and I think it's quite compelling in some respects, it's a bit like an actor's show reel, in a film actor's show reel. It was a portfolio of work that demonstrated his skill as a composer, because the mass setting in the publication is written in what Monteverdi referred to as the prima pratica, the first practice. This is strict counterpoint in the style of Palestrina and Lassus and Vittoria that is we all associate with unaccompanied choirs, with threads of polyphonic music forming this tapestry of sound, all parts being of equal importance. And that was those composers were at the height of their powers when Monteverdi was in his formative years. And Monteverdi mastered that technique. He also embraced the newly emerging seconda pratica, as he called it, second practice, that heralded the Baroque period, really. And this, is what we find in the Vespers. This is all the fireworks, the drama, the dramatic vocal writing, the spellbinding, mesmeric, kind of ornamentation, virtuosic ornamentation, and the instrumental writing that is not only idiomatic for the instruments, but also independent. Because in the age of Palestrina and Lassus, instruments were very often used in vocal music. I mean, a lot of instrumental performance featured performances of just simply instruments playing motets or madrigals, of vocal pieces. The lute, which is one of the most ubiquitous instruments in the 16th century, lute literature is full of, there are idiomatic pieces for the lute, obviously, but it's full of transcriptions of mass movements and motets and things that would ordinarily be sung by choirs or consorts of voices, actually being transcribed and made available to be performed by a lute or keyboard instruments similarly. Sorry.
Well, I'm just thinking about when you refer to the mass bit of this. So you could take there's some movements that you could take from here and sing as a mass setting.
There's a complete mass, a parody mass. It's not in here.
Oh.
It's in the original part books that were published in Venice in 1610. But you can get, obviously, modern editions of the In Illo Tempore Mass.
We haven't got that in the shot edition this time.
No.
So already the shot is not using a lot of the material that it
Yeah.
could have taken.
Yeah.
So decisions are made by creating an edition.
Yes. So for the modern performer, some of the tough decisions are made by editors. So the shot edition, it was Jerome Roche, wasn't it, has edited the shot edition. He has made choices as to what movements from that 1610 publication he's included and forms the sort of oratorio that we now perform and listen to on the concert platform. Yeah.
And it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because the cornet group, English cornets and sackbuts, are they called, are playing from a different edition.
Oh yes, you see now. This is another problem that has to be solved by anybody performing it today, because there are two movements in the Monteverdi original publication which should be transposed down a fourth. And this was just as I was working on this as an undergraduate. This kind of came out largely through the work of Andrew Parrott and the Taverner Choir. And he'd kind of uncovered a sort of lost performing tradition, if you like, that pieces that were presented originally in a high set of clefs, there's that evidence to suggest that they should be transposed down a fourth. And there are two movements in the Monteverdi, what we can now refer to as the Monteverdi Vespers, Laude Jerusalem and the Magnificat, which are originally presented in a high set of clefs and should be transposed down a fourth. And we've been able to get a set of a choral score and a set of parts for the Magnificat. So that will be down a fourth in our performance. But the Lauda Jerusalem, we haven't been able to do that. So that's going to stay at the original printed pitch. But those are some editors, modern editors now have solved it by presenting all of the works at their original written pitch, but an appendix containing those two movements down a fourth. When we did it, York University, we did the performance in the York Festival in 1980 at all written pitch. That's largely because the main tenor soloist, the aforementioned Nigel Rodgers,
oh yes,
didn't want to do it down a fourth. And then we did it a week later in another festival in Essex, and we did it with the transpositions. So but with different soloists drawn from the choir. So yeah, we experienced both.
Wow. And so you've sung it many times since then, have you?
No, in fact, I don't think I have sung it since. So this is going to be a real thrill. The last time I performed it was in Thaxted in Essex in 1980. So this is going to be great to perform it again.
Fantastic. Which movement would you have it as your desert island, one of your desert island discs?
Oh yeah, it's difficult to kind of it's like choosing your favorite child, isn't it? Kind of. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, you can't really kind of beat the opening. Actually, opening versicle and response. It's arresting, isn't it? Even though it's only just a one chord, really, effectively. But there's a good parallel with Orfeo, because the instruments are playing the toccata from Orfeo. Orfeo starts by drawing the attention of the audience to the start of the piece with this fanfare, really, played on natural trumpets. Well, that same music is used in the opening of the Vespers. Exactly the same. But yeah, but performed by cornets, sackbuts, and the strings. And actually, that's another opens up another kind of can of worms, if you like. The Monteverdi Vespers presents instruments that are not common. They're not modern orchestral instruments from the symphony orchestra. You have, well, we're familiar with violins, violas, cellos. Remember that for Monteverdi, they were really new. I mean, they were only just...
They had viol. They had
yeah,
viol
lots of viols.
Yeah.
And the violin family were... Well, Monteverdi was born in Cremona, which is where, Stradivarius and his...
When was Stradivarius there? A bit later?
I know. They started out very early with Monteverdi was at the cutting edge of using brand new instruments, really. Cornets and sackbuts had been around for most of the 16th century and were widespread. But again, scholarship has uncovered interesting things about those. The sackbut, I think, if anybody who's been familiar with symphonic music, if they looked and saw a sackbut, they'd recognize it as a trombone. And it's just got a slightly narrower bell, and it's made of lighter brass, produces a softer grain sound. But the cornet, we don't have any kind of orchestral equivalent to that at all. And it consequently produces a unique sound. So the cornet is sometimes described as a kind of cross between a woodwind instrument and a brass instrument. It's got it's got finger holes like a recorder, but the sound is generated by the lip reed principle. That is, a cupped mouthpiece and making a raspberry sound, through a mouthpiece, like that. Rather more refined than that, actually. And then, of course, you get the different pitches by changing, how many holes you're covering. The construction of the instrument is not like any other woodwind instrument, however. I mean, most of those are basically tubes of wood, aren't they? You know, you get a piece of wood and bore a hole, and then you turn it on a lathe, and you produce a kind of round shape with a hole in the middle, a bore, and then you drill some holes in for the finger holes, and you've got your flute, or your recorder, or your reed instrument, or whatever it is. A cornet, it's kind of made in two halves, and you scoop out of the wood, you carve out the shape of the bore on one half, exactly the same on the other, glue them together, and then make it airtight by covering it with leather. And then you insert this tiny acorn-shaped mouthpiece. And some players, there are some depictions of players playing the cornet from the side of the lips instead of the center of the lips, as you would a modern trumpet, say. And it produces this sound that's very, well, some 17th century writers said it was the nearest thing to the human voice. But it produces, it creates an instrument that is incredibly agile. And the violin and cornetto were effectively interchangeable during the early years of the 17th century, it would seem. And they were just as rapid and agile as one another. And so, yes, it's wonderful that over the past 50 years, people have taken up the cornet and sackbut and so on, that now mastered those instruments, and they're more commonplace than they used to be. And we can now get that sound back into the performances of the Vespers, because earlier performances, they used symphonic instruments like trumpets, oboes, clarinets, and so on, and it's just not the same.
So Thaxted, what did you have in Thaxted when you last?
We had the English cornet and sackbut ensemble.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So in there, as they were then,
Yeah.
and I should imagine all of those players have retired, moved on, and so on. They've been replaced by a younger generation. But it was essentially the same ensemble. And of course, in the York performance, we had them. Yeah.
Fantastic.
But the cornet, yeah, it is a great instrument. But I was just reading, Carolyn lent me this book called The Monteverdi Vespers of 1610 by Geoffrey Kurtzman. And I wish that had been written when I did.
It's quite a big book, isn't it?
But I wished it had been around when I did the work on this as an undergraduate. And I've just dipping into this over the last few days, and he really gets into really greater detail than I did when I did my work. He mentioned in there that it was Venice that was a kind of centre of cornetto production by the more than just the one, and they were kind of exported all over Europe. But it was the Italian cornetists that were probably used to play this music if it was ever performed in Monteverdi's time. And they hadn't mastered the technique of carrying the cornetto up into the stratospheres of its register. And that's one of the compelling arguments for transposing the Magnificat, say, down a fourth, because if it's left at written pitch, the cornetti are taken up to notes which are not typical. They're much higher than.
And therefore more difficult to
yes.
make, yeah.
But apparently the German cornetists, according to Geoffrey Kurtzman, had a kind of, managed to achieve that kind of level, but not the Italians. So, take your choice.
We'll see what the English are like.
And then the sackbuts. It turns out that Nuremberg in Germany, according to Geoffrey Kurtzman, that was the centre of sackbut production in Europe. So most of the quality sackbuts floating around Europe were from Nuremberg. And the cornetto production in Venice also had a bearing on organ tuning and pitch standard. I'm going on too much about this, too into the weeds of all this too much. But this was just not, I didn't cover any of this in my work. It was just not around, this level of degree of detail and scholarship, that
It's
I
really
could,
interesting, isn't it, that
yeah,
there's a lot more than just what seems to
yeah,
this piece.
yeah, definitely. But it's become a cornerstone of the choral repertoire now, and it's fantastic, absolutely fantastic piece.
It's a fantastic piece to sing, and it's a great piece to
Yeah,
listen to, isn't it? Because
it
of the
is.
variety.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's spellbinding. It's. I'm so looking forward to the performance.
Fantastic. So am I. And we should say the performances because we're going to promote this online. The performances is Thursday, the
So,
7th of May at 7 p.m.
yeah.
in Wells Cathedral. Please do join us.
Yes. Please come.
Thank you very much, John. It's really interesting to hear your experiences.
Thanks.